You guys love my Thin Client videos, so I'm back with another. Today we have a new login system written by one of my viewers named Josh Patton. With this login system, you can log in using the credentials for your Proxmox server, and the Thin Client will give you a list of which VMs you can access. In this case, this user has access to 3 VMs. By clicking on one of them, I can connect to it and start a virtual session. This one supports sound too, something you guys have been asking me about for a while. Like my last video, I have instructions for both Debian and for Raspberry Pi OS, although this time I walked through them on Debian on this tiny little Thin Client. But don't worry, I tested them on a Raspberry Pi 2 and a Raspberry Pi 4 as well. So follow along with me as we set up the software to make this work. If you head down to the description, there's a link to my blog post with all of the commands you can execute to set this up on both Debian and Raspberry Pi OS. And if you like this video, like and subscribe so you can see more Thin Client videos like this. Statistically, if you're watching my video, you're probably not subscribed, so you probably didn't see the previous videos in this series. So link up there to the playlist. So just a quick recap, here's how you have to set up Proxmox to use Spice. So by default, Proxmox will have the display set to default, which is standard VGA. With the default, you can use VNC to connect using the No VNC console built into Proxmox. However, using VNC to connect outside of Proxmox's built-in No VNC console isn't super easy. You have to set up a separate port number for each VM and just kind of remember what they are, and you don't get a lot of security or authentication. So instead, I've set the display for this VM to Spice. And since it's Linux, I can just set Spice and get as many monitors as I want, up to 4. If you have a Windows VM, you have to pick how many monitors you want ahead of time. With Spice, clicking on the console in Proxmox will download a configuration file for Remote Viewer, the app that's used to connect to the Spice server. This Thin Client setup is going to connect to Proxmox's API and download that same file and launch Remote Viewer on the remote system. With Spice, we also have the option to pass through some hardware. So these 4 USB devices here are set as the Spice port. And that means the Spice client can pick up to 4 USB devices to redirect through the Spice session to the virtual machine. You can create as many as you want by clicking Add USB Device Spice Port. Also for audio, we go to Add Audio Device, and you can choose the driver you want to emulate. ICH9 Intel is a pretty generic solution that should work with most modern operating systems. AC97 should work with anything in the last 2 decades. And the backend driver is Spice, forwards it through the Spice session. On the options page, you have a couple things you can choose. You can set Use Tablet for pointer. If you don't install the Spice drivers on your Windows VM, you'll need to uncheck this or the mouse won't work until the drivers are installed. Linux doesn't have any problems with that. And Spice enhancements, you have the option of turning on video streaming, which I leave off. It may or may not help depending on what you're trying to do. So once we have our virtual machine configured, we need to configure our users. Let's go to Data Center Users. I have created a user called VDI User at PVE. So PVE realm means that Proxmox is managing the authentication through the Proxmox system. It's not relying on a Linux backend or an authentication service. So that means that the username and password are both part of Proxmox's database. Then under permissions, I've created a permission that gives VDI User at PVE VM permission on VM 106. And this means that user gets all the permissions of this role, which in this case means VM audit, backup config, CD-ROM, CloudInit, console, power management. In order to use this script, all we actually need is power management, console, and audit, but the other ones aren't too bad to keep too. So the tool we're using today is written by a guy named Josh Patton. It's called PVE VDI Client. And he is a viewer of mine, and he wrote this after seeing one of my past videos. So great thanks to Josh for writing this. And today we're going to install this to run on boot to make a Thin Client appliance. So you can see it's got a login screen here, and unlike our past videos where you've logged into the local system or not logged in at all, with this system you log in using Proxmox authentication. So everyone who logs in has an account in Proxmox, either through PVE or Active Directory or LDAP. And they log in with that account, and it gives them a list of all of the VMs which their account has access to, and they can choose to connect to them. So I know I've done past videos on the Raspberry Pi, and I've tested this on both the Raspberry Pi and Debian, but today I'm going to walk through the steps on Debian. So if you need the Raspberry Pi version, the commands are down in the description below in the link to my blog post. There's very slight differences between Debian and Raspberry Pi OS. Most notably, Raspberry Pi OS support for Qt is a bit of a hot mess. So getting PySimple GUI Qt installed on Raspberry Pi OS was a bit of a pain, but on Debian it's really easy. So we're going to walk through this on Debian, and we're going to get this installed. So this is my Debian system. So we're running Debian Bullseye, and I've installed it with the LXDE desktop environment. And that is so that it's as similar as possible to the Raspberry Pi, because I want to keep the instructions as close as possible to the Pi and the Debian, so no matter what hardware you have, you'll have something that works. So that's why we're using LXDE. So now we need to do some basic housekeeping. So we're going to do apt update, apt upgrade, as we usually would. Must have done an upgrade during the install process. So now we need to install a few packages. So first one is Python 3 pip, so we can install packages through pip. We also need git, so we can download his code from GitHub. We need virt viewer, so we have the remote viewer package that we use for our thin clients, and that's it. So we're using the same Spice protocol I've used in previous Raspberry Pi thin client videos. So virt viewer is the package that includes the remote viewer app that connects to Spice. If you're on Raspberry Pi, you have to do a little dance here to also install PySide 2, which is the Qt libraries for Raspberry Pi. Okay, so now we need to install the packages through pip. So pip3 install Proxmoxer, which is the Proxmox API client for Python, and PySimple GUI Qt. Okay, so now we're going to clone Josh's repository and then cd into it. So here are all the files from his repository. We need to make the Python file executable. And in theory, we could execute it now, but it's not going to have a configuration file. We get this error here, unable to read supplied configuration file from any location. So now we get to configure the VDI client. So on Linux, it'll look for the file in a couple different places, but we're going to use etc VDI Client. So we're going to make that directory, and then create a file called VDIClient.ini in that folder. So Josh has a complete example file for VDIClient.ini in the GitHub project, and I'm just going to go through and put some examples in here. So we need a general section, we need an authentication section, and we need a host section. Everything else is optional. So in general, in theory, we could leave all of this blank, and we would have no icon and no title and all that stuff. We're going to put a title. So title. Now authentication. This section describes what authentication realm should be used by PVE, among other things. The first keyword here is auth backend. So PVE tells us to authenticate clients using the PVE realm. So if a user enters their username and password, it'll pass that to Proxmox as username @PVE. If you're using a different auth backend in Proxmox, like LDAP or Active Directory, you would put that here. If you're using two-factor authentication, you can enable or disable that here. Auth TOTP. In this case, I'm not using it, so that's false. The next one is to verify TLS certificates. If you're using a self-signed certificate, you should set this one to false. If you'd like, you can put in a username and API token, and it'll automatically log in with that user, or you can put nothing, and it'll make the user log in with their Proxmox credentials. So host, here's where we put what our Proxmox server is. So you'd put the IP address of your server. And then equals the port it's on, which should always be 8006. Unless you're proxying it. So we'll save that. And now let's see what happens when we run it. There we go. That looks decent. So I got the logo that Josh created. I got the icon that Josh created. I named it Appleards VDI. And we can log in. So it looks like I have one VM that I can connect to. So let's see what happens when we connect to it. So remote viewer pops up. We're connecting to the remote session. And there we go. So we got a pretty standard Raspberry Pi login screen here. We got our user Pi. We got a little bit more. We got Windows. So even audio works. We didn't have to set anything up on this side. We just added the audio device in Proxmox and audio works. You guys have been bugging me about audio. So there it goes. A lot easier on Debian than it is on the Pi. So now what happens is I can click log out, and that takes us back to the login screen. If I cancel, it closes. The end. So if you just want to use this on your desktop to log into your Proxmox VMs, it's pretty handy for that. But what if we want to make this launch at boot? So we have a couple files we need to edit to make it launch into this instead of launching into LXDE. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into etc xdg lx session lxde. If you're on Pi, the folder is lxde-pi instead. So there's a file here called autostart, and the autostart file is launched when an LXDE session is launched. And that's what launches LXPanel, the desktop icons, all that good stuff. And so we are going to make a copy of that and then delete it, so that when a user logs in, it doesn't auto-start anything. And then we're going to create a blank auto-start file so LXDE doesn't complain. So now if we were to reboot now, or log in now, we'd have completely blank desktop and no way to do anything. So now we're going to create an auto-start file in our user's home directory. So when our user logs in, it launches the VDI client. Then all we have to do is set our user to log in automatically on boot, and it'll launch right into our VDI client. So the folder we need to edit this time is in home directory .config lx session lxde. And again, on Raspberry Pi OS, it's lxde-pi. The file is called autostart. So feature app alert here, I made a little bit of a mistake. The actual path here should be @/user/bin/bash, and then the full path to the Thin Client script, which in this case is /home/VDI user/Thin Client. And obviously VDI user would be whatever user you're using for this. So I'm going to actually make that shell script. And so here what we're going to do is we're going to say while true do So we're calling Python 3 and giving it the path to the VDI client file. Done. And make it executable. So now our client comes up. If we close it, it comes up again. So there, now it won't quit. Now we're just going to kill the whole terminal to get rid of it. So before we log out, while we still have a desktop environment here, we're going to change it so that it automatically logs into our user. We're going to edit the LightDM configuration. LightDM is the login manager, and tell it what user to auto log in as. If you're on the Raspberry Pi, you can just run sudo raspi config and tell it to auto log into a desktop. And it'll do this for you. So we're looking for a line that says auto login-user. It's going to be somewhere here under seat configuration. Auto login user. And in this case, we're going to type our username, which in this case is VDI user. Done. So now if we reboot, we're not going to have a desktop environment. We're going to get automatically logged in, and it's going to launch the Thin Client script. So let's see what happens. So now we boot it up and we got this. So we got a black screen and we got a login prompt. And we have one VM we can connect to. And we connect. And it's thinking about it. There we go.
Straight to the virtual machine.
Good thing sound still works too. We exit. We get taken back here. We can log out, get back to the login screen. So on Raspberry Pi, this is very similar. There's a couple quirks to getting Pi Simple GUI Qt installed, because Qt on Raspberry Pi is a bit of a hot mess. At the end of my last video, I said that my goal is to get to a place like commercial VDI solutions, where a user can come up to the Thin Client, log in with their system-wide account information, and be given a list of VM types to choose from. Do they need Windows? Do they need Linux? Do they need special installed software? And a VM clone would be created for them. We're not there yet still, but we're getting closer. Now, we're at a point where each user can have their own virtual machine or virtual machines, and the Thin Client lets them log into whichever ones they have access to from this Proxmox Central Authentication database. This is a big step up from the last revision of this project if you're in an environment where you have centralized user authentication. With this setup, we no longer need to allocate specific VM IDs for the Thin Client and hardcode those VM IDs in the scripts. The Python tool downloads the list of all VMs that the user has access to for us. Again, thanks to Josh Patton, who wrote this Python tool. Link to his GitHub is down in the description below. Stay tuned for more virtual desktop infrastructure and other Linux fun.